Hey everyone, I'm Matt. You don't usually hear from me on this show, but today's a little different. For anyone new here, this is Catching Up, the podcast where conversations don't end when the bell rings. Normally, my brother Peter sits in this chair reconnecting with former students, colleagues, and friends. Today, we're flipping the script. I'm interviewing him. Make sure you're following us on Instagram at the Catching Up Podcast for clips, updates, and behind the scenes content. So, Peter NG, my older brother, let's get into it.
How you doing? It's interesting being on the other side.
Does it sound weird at all?
A little bit, but I mean, I've also had a little bit more experience just kind of getting comfortable with my voice and like how I want the tune of everything. So, yeah, I'm excited to be on the other side of things for once and get a little more into my background and my past.
Sure, sure. I guess before we get into it, I want to go off script right away and ask you, is there anything
All
you've
right.
learned recently?
Okay, yes. I wouldn't say it's necessarily like a brand new thing I learned, but I did get to watch The Odyssey this last weekend.
Hmm.
Excellent movie. It is a longer one, so definitely, uh, try to be as attentive as possible and go to the bathroom beforehand. But one of my favorite games that I know Matt's a big fan of as well is Hades by Supergiant and Hades 2.
Hmm.
Those are games obviously built around Greek mythos. It was really cool because I hadn't read the Odyssey since like high school, but it was really cool seeing how much attention to detail the games play into the Greek mythology, especially the second game with Odysseus being a character. And yeah, there was just so many moments where I was like, oh, that's from the game. Obviously, they take a little more creative liberties and put more of a personal spin on it, but that really stood out to me, and that kind of was a nice little touch watching the movie.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'll see it in theaters, but I've definitely been seeing a lot of buzz. Well, let's go ahead and get straight into it then. So my first question will be, for anyone listening who doesn't know us, what's the age gap between us, and what was it like growing up together?
Yeah, so we're 4 years apart. We our growing up process was rather interesting. So I actually have a memory, a vivid memory of when you were born and holding you in the hospital. Granted, I was just 4 years old, but that's one of my first memories I can remember. Yeah, I think like most siblings, we were always together, doing a lot of things, getting on each other's nerves from time to time. But we had a deep passion for a lot of similar hobbies and activities, and we just found spending a ton of time together and just doing a bunch of stuff together. There's a lot of moments that really stand out to me, and that might come up later, so I won't get ahead of myself. But it was interesting being 4 years apart because when I was finishing high school, that's around the time you were finishing middle school, and when I went off to college at UCF in Orlando, that was the first time that we were apart for prolonged time. So, those are moments that both of us got to grow and find ourselves a little more. But it was also a bit different of like, oh, you don't see your brother 24/7. And then it only developed even further beyond that when I finished college, you started college at UF in Gainesville, and we were kind of doing our own things. And it wasn't until you started your master's and eventually your PhD at UCF that we kind of had a chance to reconnect and spend a lot more time from there.
Yeah, I have another off script question that is a little related to this topic, but I'm
Okay.
curious if you could control at all, what do you think about the gap in our age? Do you think we would be closer or further apart if we were closer in age or further apart in age? Or do you have any
Hmm.
thoughts about that?
That's an interesting question. I think if we were further in age, I know people that have siblings that are like 6, 8, 10 even years apart, and they can still have a very close relationship. I don't know. Part of me feels like if we were even further apart, the odds or the chances of kind of like not necessarily growing apart, but just having our own lives and doing our own thing. And, we see each other for holidays, but maybe not as often we talk to each other or try to like spend time with each other. I think that would have been a higher chance. But simultaneously, if we were, let's say, a year apart or even twins in some weird alternate world. I do think there's a pretty realistic world where we get pretty sick of each other,
A
and
100% agree.
we probably would have needed a little more like space and say, hey, um, like I easily could have seen. I've seen some situations with students of mine who are like twins, and they don't go to the same college together, and it's purely because they're like, I don't want to be in the shadow of my sibling, and I want to be me. So I think that might have happened for sure. So I'll say maybe at the youngest side, 2 years would have not changed much, to be honest. And maybe on the older side, like up to 6 years, 5 years, maybe. But I think four is a nice little sweet spot because it gives you that time when you're kind of going through pretty big chapters of life to figure things out on your own a little bit and not, necessarily feel like, okay, my brother or my sister is always going to be that person who tells me what to do. If you're the younger, for example. But yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, yeah, I fully agree. Well, I've got a question a little bit to transition towards more on the teaching side. Is there a moment when you started teaching, or even before that? I remember you worked at Nike for a while. Is there any moments like that still stick with you?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a number of jobs throughout my life. I do think all people should experience some sort of customer service related work in their lives. It would humanize a lot and teach you a little bit of humility as well, as far as how to work with others and not treat people like garbage. Um, my teaching career has certainly been the biggest shift and the most prominent career I've had and the longest term thing that I've done. There are countless moments that have stood out to me as a teacher. I think the things that stand out the most, as most teachers will attest to, is the influence you have and the ability to be a positive role model, number one, but also leave something behind for them to remember. I think this, and I'm sure you think this as well, that anyone who's ever had significant success has had a teacher in their lives that influenced them. Not necessarily one to one, like some of my favorite teachers, like Mr. Tusing from Nice, where we went to high school. I didn't become a government teacher, or Mr. Toblin, who was my psychology teacher. I didn't become a psychology teacher. I mean, I ended up becoming a teacher, so there is a little more similarity there. But I had such a pleasant and happy experience with those classes while learning, and that's what I've tried to take in my situation is just say, hey, I know not everyone's going to become a doctor, a nurse, or medical professional or whatever, but I want this time to be memorable and I want this time to feel good. And if I can help you out with one thing or something even larger if needed, then that's what I'm here for.
Absolutely. Well, I want to move us towards a question that I think has come up quite a few times, especially in earlier episodes. So I want you to think about what your time was like growing up and what you thought you might have pictured yourself doing when you grew up. Obviously, before you started teaching, was there anything that you thought you would pursue that wasn't teaching?
Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit in my solo episode that I've done, my first solo episode. I plan to do a couple more, kind of going into the background and the learning thing, the things I've learned throughout my career. But yeah, since I was a kid, I've wanted to become a doctor. Our dad's a doctor; he's a pediatrician, so I saw firsthand what that looked like. I've always been intrigued by science. I think you as well have been intrigued by science. Um, I've always wanted to help people and be working with people in some form, in some degree. And yeah, I kind of thought this is it. I was always on that track from as early as I can remember, drawing on a little, like in like first or second grade. It was like I remember a line paper where I drew me and what looked like a doctor next to me and saying like I want to become a doctor so I can help people.
Mm,
And that was my calling for so long. Not until I reached college, and truthfully, even in high school, it should have been a little more of a wake up call as far as work ethic for me. Um, I don't think I was the most lazy or like I just don't care and I'm just gonna half ass it all. But the reality is, unless you are incredibly gifted and this stuff just comes in immediately to you and you don't really have to work too hard, at least at the high school or college level, it is a major sacrifice to become one of these professions that require intensive education. And I still think now, in my, you know, turning 35, I still think now I certainly have what it takes if I wanted to have become a doctor, and maybe like in a similar timeline. That's what I'm doing and helping people. But what I had to learn my way was there are ways to help people that don't require going to med school and don't require, especially at the time, the grades that I had and the scores that I had received at best would have got me into a Caribbean school. And nothing against that. There are incredible physicians that go there, but it tends to be more expensive. There's a bit of a stigma around that as well. But yeah, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that at best you're paying off within a decade to 14 years for most doctors. And that was scaring me. So I
Yeah.
was able to figure it out after some soul searching and just started trying new things. But I ultimately realized like my North Star was I just want to be able to help people in one way or another and work with people. I didn't want to just do something that isolated me from others.
I have a quick follow up question. You mentioned how, you probably could have had a wake up call earlier in high school around the work ethic that you put it. Do you think there is any credence to the idea that yes, you wanted to become a medical doctor since you were a young child, but at the end of the day, if you weren't interested enough in it, you weren't going to be as motivated to do that work. So do you think it is so much as you didn't have the work ethic, or is it more just a matter of simply your interest was more superficial? It wasn't necessarily a deep passion that would drive you through that work.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it might be a little column A, column B. I didn't learn much more about the industry and what it takes to do this stuff until I was in college, when I started doing some more volunteer work and shadowing opportunities, and I got to see firsthand how it looks. And that never pushed me away necessarily. I was more just reinforced, and I was like, "Oh, okay, sounds good." But yeah, I think in high school at least, I never recognized the amount of work it was going to end up taking and the amount of commitment and time sacrifice that it would end up taking. You and I both did IB, and I started IB and the pre IB stuff sophomore year, unlike most students who started freshman year. And that was a massive adjustment for me regarding just the amount of work you have to do to keep up with stuff. And I've that's kind of what I've told a lot of students over the years in my experience. And I don't teach an IB course, and we don't even have IB at my old school. But the ultimate goal of high school should be to learn how to learn, and then you apply those skills in your future, whatever your future holds for you, and you should be able to adapt quicker instead of going into college or going into your adult life and having no clue and just kind of being aimless. So I don't feel like I was in that aimless position. I did eventually adapt to it. However, I can think back to that time period and still feel like my adapting was not as all in as I probably needed to be to hit the ground running in college and say, okay, I already know how bad I want this. I just got to keep pushing and show that I'm capable, instead of just kind of one foot in, one foot out, saying it'll work itself out. It'll be fine. Um, and again, at the end of the day, I technically had the criteria if I wanted to go to some places, but I just made it much harder on me.
Mm. Well, we've been talking about this topic a little bit, but I want to get a little more specific here. This can be pretty difficult, I think, for most people, but do you feel like could you pinpoint a specific moment that really changed your overall trajectory or direction in your past?
Yeah, so I was in I'm trying to remember the exact name of the class, but it was my third year. I still had like a year or even like a semester left before finishing my undergrad. And I had already, at this point, by the time I'm taking these classes, I had already failed numerous classes. I already had to retake numerous classes just to save and salvage my GPA. So I had already gone through the ringer of struggling. I had done well in certain classes too, and I was like, okay, I see I have some potential here. But I was in it was a very small class. It was like I think it was an immunology type class, or no, it was an infectious pathology class. So it was a study of disease. And it was a really great class, honestly. I did well. It was a lot of projects where I had to work with others to create presentations on diseases that we'd research. And the professor was great. He was actually Omar, one of my closer friends. He worked for that professor in the lab scenario. But this was so far into into my undergrad and like the specialty courses and the upper class electives that needed to be taken, that I kind of had a moment that I was walking from class to the student union, and I started not necessarily panicking. I don't necessarily think at that age in my early 20s I was experiencing anxiety yet. But I started doubting myself. Um, and that's really what was the source of my shift. It was so far into my degree that there was no reason or logic, especially because I only had 4 years through my Bright Futures and then our parents prepaid. But it made no sense to switch my degree 3.5 semesters or years into my degree. And I started to have a lot of doubt about my potential and my capabilities. And when that doubt really creeps in, you start to think, okay, maybe this isn't for me. So that's really the moment that changed everything, I think, for me. And even when I came back from Chicago and moved to Orlando again and started teaching, there were many years where, and I'll talk about this in a future single episode, but there were many years where I was 1 foot in, 1 foot out on the teaching job, and it wasn't because I was upset or hating the profession. I just kept thinking and feeling this isn't enough, and I don't know if it's just preconceived notions or this belief, unfortunately, that our society plays or puts upon certain professions, that certain professions are just not qualified or not deserving of that level of reputation. And teaching is a very weird one because you do get a lot of love and admiration from others in the form of pity. But when it comes down to respect as a profession, it is more often than not just viewed as, okay, well, you're babysitting kids and you get summers off. So why are you complaining? So I think a
Right.
lot of that kind of stuck with me for so many years of my teaching career, where I just kept thinking to myself, I do really love this. I feel pretty good at this, but there's got to be more for me. And
Mm.
that wasn't the healthiest mindset for me.
I have a hypothetical question. So, you talked about how this moment where you're nearing the end of your bachelor's degrees, have a few more semesters, maybe one up to about two or three left. And you're thinking about, this might not be for me, but at the same time, you were kind of playing the pragmatic calculus of, well, I can't really switch majors now because I'm already 3 years in. The Florida Bright Futures scholarship is a 4 year scholarship, and Florida Prepaid is a pay plan that's typically for 4 years. So, financially speaking, you may not have been able to pursue that. Do you ever think to yourself, if you were overly cautious around that, and if you could go back, would you, pull the trigger and actually switch majors?
At that time, with like 3.5 years under my belt,
Hmm.
I don't think so. I think I still would have finished it out, even knowing the circumstances and everything like that. It was just so far in, and with the finish line so close in sight, that it just didn't make a much too much sense to me. I have put a lot of thought into what would I have majored in if I could redo college entirely as far as my undergrad,
Hmm.
because you can go back and obviously get more undergraduate degrees if you wanted. But
Sure.
if I had that reset button per se, I still think I would have done science, but I probably would have done health sciences instead.
Hmm.
It's the people I knew in health science degree seeking took a lot of similar classes as me, so it wouldn't have been worlds different. But simultaneously, my degree in molecular biology, which is molecular and microbiology, which is now biomedical sciences, is either a pre-med, quote unquote pre-med degree, so you're just taking it because it checks all the boxes for qualifying to apply to med schools, or you're like intending to work in a lab in your future. And that was not it for me. I definitely did not want to do that. And obviously the med school thing kind of became a question in the air for me. So I would have done health science. That certainly would have been my better option. The classes overall were not as difficult for what you needed to take specific to your degree. I still would have had to take anatomy. I still would have had to take calculus. I still would have had to take so many similar classes, biochemistry, etc. But some of those higher level electives that were so niche to the lab side of things, I despised. So I don't think it would have been a drastic change. And even I've had people ask me like, would you have pursued an education degree? Nothing against people who get their degrees in education and know out the gate they want to be teachers. But for me, I've been lucky enough that the teaching side, the pedagogy and learning how to teach children came much more natural to me. I still had to do like about a 2 year program through Orange County Public Schools to get certified to be a long term teacher and not be on a temporary license. But a lot of the things about what it takes to teach, I just learned instinctively. I don't think everyone has that, to be totally upfront. And I think if you're not someone that's already good with that, like you've learned through babysitting or camp counseling or other moments where you have one like instances of working with others, then sure, going the teaching route is super helpful or the education route in college is super helpful, because to get your degree you have to shadow multiple schools, and then your final year you co-teach a class with a experienced teacher. That's incredible. I mean, I would have killed for that experience when I started, but I knowing what I know, it was very I was very fortunate that I had more of the science background, but the teaching side just came more natural to me. And I know a lot of people similar to me that didn't go to school for teaching, so they have a much more sophisticated, might be the word, comprehension of the subject matter. They feel comfortable, and once they got that down, it just becomes how do you talk and how do you get your message across and how can you spin that story that needs to be spun.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely think it sounds like if you would have pursued an education undergraduate degree, likely the value would have been more around that realistic job preview of what exactly does it actually look like. But in terms of the strategies in the classroom, a lot of the stuff that's talked about, especially at the higher education level, is like the scholarship of teaching and learning. How do you go about improving your pedagogy? I definitely experienced similar reactions where I feel like a lot of I've read up and done a little bit of research in the scholarship of teaching and learning, but a lot of it seems intuitive to me, and yet I also see a lot of other faculty members who seem like they've never thought about teaching before or never thought about it in a way. So I do think there's probably something to be said about some people just handle the teaching side a little bit easier.
I think for the people that lack the intuition that you're talking about of what it means to teach, like many skills in life, it can be taught. It's something you can learn how to teach. But yeah, if you're not open to that and you're just kind of going through the motions, your students will suffer. And many people in college, especially, I mean, high school and maybe middle school, but high school kids also have had horror stories with teachers. But virtually every college student has had these horror stories of professors that are very intelligent people. This is not criticizing their intelligence in the slightest, but there's a difference between being masters of your subject matter versus the ability to actually relay that information to people who are trying to learn it.
Oh
So,
yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of those things that if you got it, you got it, and if you don't, you can learn it, but you have to be willing to learn it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and take us in a slightly different direction now. So we're going to move on to the what would you tell your past self segment. So, if you could sit across from yourself, your 16-year-old self, what would you tell them?
Well, I've done now almost 20 episodes of this podcast. So every time I ask my guests, I instinctively think a little bit about this myself. Um, High school was interesting for me. My teenage years was interesting for me because the way I've described it, if I had to describe it in one word, is chameleon. And the reason why I say chameleon is I felt like when I was in school, I was friends with everyone, but the deep friendships, I guess, that can develop into decades long friendships and lifelong friendships, I don't know how much I had of that. And I think it's normal that when you get out of high school, you may not keep in touch with a lot of people, especially when you leave your city or even your state. That's expected. But thinking back to what my relationships looked like back then, a lot of that was just circumstantial. Um, the fact that we were all going to the same school together, you know, I, I very easily could adjust some personality traits. I don't think the core of me was changing every time I would talk to different groups, but like the cliques, quote unquote, it was something that I could very easily turn on and off to make people feel comfortable. I never wanted people to feel uncomfortable. But if I could tell myself anything, what I've learned very late in life, as far as now in my 30s, especially like in my earlier 30s, is, well, two big things. But number one is don't be afraid to explore. Don't be afraid to do things that you want to do that others may not be as interested in. I've learned now, this far into life, how much I'm into like certain like electronic music and things like that back then I never would have even given a chance. um, I've learned now, and I knew back then that I didn't mind dancing, but it was not something I would be so open to, or even like karaoke or things that generally speaking make you feel embarrassed, and has become more a thing in my life now where it's like I have fun, I enjoy it, who cares? I get that a lot of people despise this stuff because they still feel very judged by themselves or by others. But when I started dyeing my hair when I was teaching when I was teaching in high school, um, that became such a liberating thing for me of no one cares. And if anyone has any problems, they can come up to my big ass and tell me to my face that they have issues with the way I look or the things I do. And I've yet to have that ever happen because in real society, this stuff doesn't tend to happen. And if it ever does happen, you don't need those people in your life anyway. So that's the big thing I think I would tell myself is just don't be afraid to discover more about yourself and learn who you are instead of just molding yourself around like Play-Doh or clay, molding yourself around others because it's just how others are, or like trying to appeal to the masses. And then my number two is more just a health thing. As I'm getting older, as you're getting older, everyone starts to feel those aches a little more than normal. I desperately wish I would have stuck to weightlifting in high school. I tell everyone, not just the guys, it's this common stereotype that only men weightlift. I think everyone should be weightlifting. But I tell all my students whenever I teach muscular system especially, this is such a prime time to get into it because it's like a cheat code when you're that young. The recovery rate, first of all, in case you sprain something, obviously you want to make sure you're lifting correctly, is much faster. But you're growing so quickly that if you get the form down, by the time you're in your early 20s, you'll have a transformation. And the goal doesn't necessarily have to be looking like an Adonis or an Athena. You don't have to look like these Greek figures. You just have, if you want to be healthy but strong and have less pain in your future, that's it. I did like a weightlifting class when I was in high school, but outside of one day a week where we had to do abs, I think I never worked out. And it was most of the kids that I was friends with. We were just standing around on the bleachers. Whereas the actual kids working out, they were working up a sweat every time. But I was just like, oh, who cares? You know, this is a joke thing. So that's the other two, number two, I would say.
Do you think if you actually had the ability to have this conversation, do you think your 16-year-old self would actually listen to any of that?
I think so. What I've learned, and I'm still learning, but what I've learned is I tend to have a tendency to rely on someone to tell me what to do. And that can be good and bad. Sometimes it's a good thing because I'm very open to you're like to reaching out to others and saying, you know more about this than me, or I trust you about this topic. Please just tell me what to do or give me the information and I'm going to work with that. But it's a bad thing because it can be a bad thing because if I'm just sitting waiting on someone to tell me, nothing happens. Or it puts the onus on others to constantly have to tell me what to do or to control and organize me. And that's just more mental load than necessary. So I would like to think, yes, I think back then especially I was waiting for that moment of just like, hey, you're on the right track or you're doing this right or try doing this instead. And I never really had that. You know, it's not to say that I didn't have any adult figures that didn't support me or believe in me. I don't think that was the case at all. It's just I if I had that opportunity and it was a mysterious hooded figure just telling me from a younger age uh, the things I mentioned earlier, I don't know. I think it would have stuck a little more and been like, okay,
Do you think that moment exists? Or do you think that that is just hopeful thinking that, you know, that kind of moment where suddenly you feel like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing? I find that a lot of people, I don't know, when I speak with, especially when I'm speaking with students, sometimes there's their language reveals that they assume that there's supposed to be a right way of doing things or there's
yeah.
supposed to be a correct path that they're supposed to follow. Do you feel like there is a moment that exists where people feel like, ah, yes, this is when I'm supposed to do something, or this is what I'm supposed to pursue? Or do you think that's just your way of rationalizing, well, in this time of my life, I felt kind of adrift. So clearly I must have missed that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I think for that is I do like in an almost romanticized kind of way. I do think a moment like that is real. However, the hard part is when you get further in life and things do work out or whatever. I think the hard part is recognizing or having the moment to reflect and actually look back at life and realize that it wasn't necessarily a quote unquote special moment of the crossroads immediately changing, more so that the many actions that had to happen brought you there. So I guess what I'm saying is when I have this belief of like, oh, there's that moment, it kind of acts as like a carrot on the like incentivizing you almost of like my time will come, my time will come, my time will come. Like I just gotta find that moment. Obviously, if you're expecting it to be this like win the lottery situation, that's just not realistic at all. But if you're open minded, you go with the things that are brought to you in your life and you try to make the most of those actions, yeah, I think if you have that moment of reflection later, when your life does look so different and hopefully better, and you look back, you'll see it wasn't just necessarily one moment. It was many, many moments that had to kind of domino effect to get you there.
Hmm. Well, we've been talking a lot about what advice you would give yourself when you were younger, but is there anything that you feel like you are particularly proud of, how you were when you were 16 or around that age?
Yeah, I think something that I'm very proud of is I never treated anyone poorly for any reason. I, I can't think of a single moment in life that I viewed someone, at least for like surface level differences or things that like as a school, like as a kid, you recognize more, or you know you're in groups and you're out groups. I quite literally had friendships or at least bonds with all different groups of people, and you know, high school in the early 2000s was different than high school it is today and school today in the 2020s. But I'm very proud of the fact that I, even if it felt a little hollow looking back now, and the word chameleon can kind of come off a little negative, I've mostly made people comfortable, and that was always my intention, was to I genuinely enjoyed the company of these people and wanted to spend more time with these people, etc. But I never wanted anyone to feel uncomfortable around me, and I always wanted them to feel like they could trust me and that I was someone in their corner. And you know, that's kind of been something funny enough that I still keep to this day as an adult. Understandably, with my stature, a lot of people kind of feel a little cautious when they meet me for the first time, and for some reason think I'm like this ogre giant who's about to be aggressive with them. And I always try to say like, hey, I'm a very open minded individual, and I hope that you understand that I'm here to be friendly with you and hopefully make you feel comfortable and seen. The only time that I really put my foot in the ground is when someone is treating another person negatively, and that's just something that I can't stand for, and it's something that really paints a picture on this of this person that tells me I don't want to spend time with this person any longer. But yeah, as a student when I was in teenage years, I would say that was probably something I was most proud of, is the ability to connect with all sorts of different people.
Do you feel like that, kind of, ironically, that facet of yours, which I would agree with, I think to this day you are an incredibly amicable person. I think when I think of someone who's easy to get along with, you're probably the first person that comes to mind. But do you feel like that attitude you had when you were 16, around that age, is actually now something that you have to actively keep in check, because of what you were talking about earlier, in terms of you were almost too focused on making sure other people are comfortable and not as focused on what you personally are interested in or what you personally want to put your time and effort into?
I think so. Yeah, for sure. It's been more of a proactive conversation with myself and Julia and other people near me, is just recognizing the things I want to do. But I also don't necessarily want to ever turn off that, as far as like, I do want to go out of my way in social settings and approach the person who's alone and just engage in conversation with them, and try to make them feel like they're a part of that in group as well, or make them feel like they're not by themselves. So I do still find that as a draw for me, but I've been able to have more of a realistic conversation, I think, with myself, and lots of therapy as well, to recognize that there's a balance in life. It's not healthy to just fully commit everything of who you are to others, because then you're left with nothing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really great jumping off point then to look towards the future. So at this point, what would you consider your next step? What do you think you're going towards or you're growing towards?
That's a great question, because still figuring a lot of that out. I think that's something that our generation, my generation, the millennial generation, has kind of been in this weird position of like, I know some millennials that are already fully established as far as like careers, been set for 10 plus years, married or in a partnership for a long time, maybe kids, things on the south on the outside look great. And I think people can do that very easily. Is on the outside it looks great. I think for me, I am trying to establish or determine what will my legacy be, or what will I leave behind. I think for a lot of people, the easy answer, I mean, it's not an easy thing in the slightest, but like the natural, quote unquote, natural answer is children. Like that's a literal thing you're leaving behind. But in the cases where children don't happen, where a couple doesn't have kids, I I think that's my thing now. Is I'm trying to kind of figure out what is it that I'm leaving behind that will hopefully improve things in the future. I know in the 10 years I've been teaching, I've taught about 1,000-ish students. If I had to give a guesstimate, I know so many of those kids I've influenced positively, and I would hope that in the butterfly effect that turns into, you know, incredible things in their lives. But a part of me, I don't know, I think a part of me is searching and seeking for something more concrete that I can see or physically recognize as a capstone almost of like, this is it. And I know I'm not expecting that to happen now or in my 30s necessarily or whatever, but I think if I had that Mount Everest or that Moby Dick or that something that you can physically manifest or see that you're building to, then I could say, okay, I've planted the flag. I've done it. And I don't know if that's like the thing that even when I was starting teaching and I expressed how I was uncertain of the qualification of my job, if I was doing enough. I don't know if that's connected to all of this. It's just this feeling of wanting to leave behind something that makes you feel like you did something worth a damn, and that you actually changed stuff. Um, and how that happens and how that approaches or how that comes for everyone is different. Um, so yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things that you mentioned now that, I think a lot of people, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of people in the society that we live in often find the need to leave something behind. And I think one important thing to do for everybody is to consider, how do you define leaving something behind? Because I think traditionally, if we're thinking even historically speaking, some of the influences of now past empires was the idea of these rulers wanting to leave behind these monolithic landmarks so that they could be remembered. And it's a very literal sense of leaving something behind. But I think it should not be thought of as the primary or even correct, let's say, way to leave an impact. I think we often are socialized to think our interactions with others is expendable. It happens very quickly and it's fleeting, but that giant house or the building named after you, or whatever you have done, that's going to last longer. But the reality is all we are is people who are on this planet for a set amount of time. And in a lot of ways, one of the best things that you could do is just leave the planet off in a better place than it was before you came, and you didn't actively make it worse. And I think from my perspective, I think you are constantly doing that in terms of the people you're interacting with. I mean, even this podcast series, all the various different students who are not just willing, but are excited to catch up with you. I think that speaks volumes. Not everybody has that. And so I would challenge you to, really think about, what does it mean to leave something behind, and how do we define that?
Yeah, I appreciate the words, and it does emphasize, or it does ring through me in a very real way. I don't know. It's a weird feeling. I don't think, when I say like concrete, I know like literally, you like a building named after you or whatever. I don't know if that's ever something that I'll be like, wow, I did it. It's funny when I think about like the ultimate sign of success, I guess from me as a teacher, or as an educator for that matter, is there's like a fantasy I have of like a student of mine winning some massive award, like an Oscar or an Emmy or a Nobel Prize or something. And that moment of recognition of like, I need to thank my teacher who really got me here, or like was an inspiration or whatever. I don't know. That would feel like the ultimate culmination. But to what you're exactly saying, if I'm simply just waiting on that moment, that's an unrealistic expectation, but also like it sets me up for disappointment. So instead, I try my best to really appreciate and not take for granted the moments that I do have with my students that I've taught a year ago to up to 10 years ago. And when they share all these moments with me of how their life has changed and where they're at. And it doesn't have to necessarily be the Nobel Peace Prize winner, but I think like in a fantastical setting, that's kind of where my brain goes.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's fair. And I think as everyone who knows you well knows that you are prone to think fantastically. So,
That's true.
so let's kind of take a little bit of a side street here, one not commonly traveled. Let's talk a little bit just, sibling to sibling here. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you a question that I'm not sure if I'm going to regret or not, but what's something about me you've never said to my face?
Whoa. Okay, that's a bombshell question. Something about you I've never said to your face.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh man. I mean, you know me. I'm a very honest, open person.
Yeah, the challenge with this question is that there's not a lot that you keep kind of locked behind pursed lips. So,
No, yeah, that's true. Let me give it a little bit of thought. I think okay. I'm rather certain that I've mentioned this at some point, or it has come up in conversation at some point. But I think when you were in college specifically, and you were obviously prioritizing your undergrad and living the college life and whatever, it was a little odd to me. You had friends. I'm not saying you're an antisocial person. You are a very social individual. Um, but I think it was a little strange to me how your experience with partners or people you had romantic interest in, at least anytime I tried to get any information out of you or whatever, was invisible, non-existent. And I'm not even saying you didn't necessarily have any. It's more just I was a bit shocked that you were going through like as many college age kids go through and adults go through, like that discovery of who they are and what they want to do and make mistakes and whatever. Like that's all college life. But anytime I would try to poke and prod and be like, "Hey, so anyone of interest?" I it was just flatline. So I think that's the only thing I can probably think of that again I've probably alluded to before, but
Yeah, I don't think I'm struggling to recall if you've ever brought this up before. And I'd love to say that that is a result of my, undivided attention towards my studies or other aspects of my life. But to be completely honest, I think it has more to do with a lack of effort. I think, one thing that, a book that we both have read, I borrowed the book from you, and I think I still have it actually, is a Modern Romance by Aziz
yep.
Ansari.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing about pursuing romantic relationships in the modern day that I just don't really have the wherewithal for is the level of, or at least I didn't have that wherewithal when I was younger, was the level of vulnerability you need to be able to present if you want it to work. I think, a lot of people talk about how terrible dating apps are, and there's actually quite a bit of research to show that there is reason to believe that dating apps are not necessarily the best thing possible for the human brain. However, I do think that they can work, and obviously you are evidence that it can work. But I do think that there is a commonly ignored assumption, which is it's not just about going on the apps, it's about actually being yourself. And when you are yourself, that's going to lead to rejection. It's going to lead to people not liking what they see. But it will also lead to is people liking what they see. Versus if you're too preoccupied with your self-image, preoccupied with what people would like, you're kind of setting up a trap for yourself to eventually meet some people and more likely than not find that they're not the type of people you're interested in because you never actually presented yourself honestly. And, when I was in college, I don't think I was ever that eager. And I think one last thing I want to ask while, we have this special time, is there any memory of us growing up that you think about more as you've gotten older?
There's plenty of plenty of memories when I think of us growing up. Let me think on like a more formative, I guess, memory or something that really stood out to me.
I definitely
How about you?
remember.
You start, and then I'll give you something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, this one's not as meaningful necessarily, but it's something that I think over the last couple years I recall more and more frequently. Just our parents. We lived about an hour ish south of Jacksonville, and that's
Mhm.
where the closest Costco was. And so I remember usually when our parents would go to Costco, at a certain point they stopped bringing us along, probably because we were complaining too much. And so they would leave us at home. And being at home for what turned out to be about at least a 6 hour window generally resulted in sometimes us ordering pizza for dinner, which that was always great, Domino's. But
Yep.
then
Yep.
also, I remember we would be playing co-op Halo 2 or
Oh
Halo
man.
2 online lobbies. And that was definitely, I think, something that it was just a fun time. I
Yeah.
don't think that there's a lot of, as a lot of gaming stuff. I think gaming, as you mentioned earlier, has been something that when we were both growing up in the same house was one of those things that we shared in common in terms of interests. And so that was just a good time.
Okay, I like that. Mine's kind of related. It's such a weird thing to focus on, but I do remember it pretty vividly. I think I was in high school and you must have been in middle school at this time. But I remember we'd watch Naruto Shippuden on a laptop on some illegal website with
Hmm.
like the worst ads you'd ever see, and like
Pop-ups everywhere.
yeah, the lowest potential upload ever. But it was in English. I want to say it was dub that we were watching, or maybe even sub. Do
I
you
think
remember
it was
the sub?
probably dub. It was
Dub.
probably dub.
Um, but I just remember it was the final arc of Shippuden, and there's a long stretch of that final arc where a considerable amount of filler for those uninitiated is just like episodes that are not canon or not necessary for the story to move ahead,
Right, not progressing the
where
plot at
yeah,
all.
not progressing the plot. And I just remember we flip up the tablet or the computer, pull up the episode, and just the agony of just watching another episode where like, okay, nothing really happens this week. When will we ever do anything? But
Hmm.
watching that was, yeah, that was a very vivid memory and a very fond memory for sure. I had something else that I was just thinking of that was like, it was like a fleeting thing, but I don't know why it just kind of ran away. But a large part of it, kind of going to what you're saying, was just those times that, oh, I just remembered, we were in Washington D.C. and
Hmm.
you were
No.
significantly younger, but our parents ended up going to Ruth Chris Steakhouse, and I wasn't necessarily the biggest fans of steak. Neither were you, but we were also just so like not in the mindset of walking around and going and doing the touristy stuff. So our parents just left us in the hotel room, and we just ordered room service, and there was a, I think, an N64
Hmm.
or in the TV, like built in, and we were
Yep.
just playing. I want to say it was like Kirby or something like that,
I think it was
uh,
Donkey Kong Country
Donkey
or
Kong
something like
Country,
that.
and
Yeah.
yeah, it's just another one of those moments where it was like we clearly were going to be dragging our feet and not being participants, good participants, if we would have been around. And also, like, nothing wrong with our parents just having a little more alone time for them, but those moments, yeah, I tend to think of the most of just, and like I think also just like so many vocal stems that we had just growing up, and especially with like our surrounding pop culture or video games or anime or whatever, that like it's how those inside jokes kind of form and those
Hmm.
memories continue to develop.
Yeah. Well, the moral of the story is for those of you who have children, don't bring them anywhere until they're at least like 13
I
because
mean,
there's literally no value. Don't do it.
I've listen. A mild to hot take is I've said like I get it. The international travel with your kids can be an incredible experience, but like, man, I really don't know how much of that, unless like in photos, cool. When you're older, you can look back, but how much will you remember? Like,
Yeah, and there's something to be said about maybe we were not the best subjects for that kind of experiment to see if we would actually get
oh,
any value from it. So,
yeah, that's
um,
fair. That's
but
fair.
yeah. All right, so we can go ahead and wrap up. I think we've been yapping enough on this episode. Thanks again for being here and for letting me catch up with you for once. If you enjoyed this one, share it with someone who could use a reminder that growth isn't always linear, and follow us on Instagram at _catching up podcast for clips every Friday.
I appreciate it, Matt. Thank you. And it was a cool experience kind of being on the other side of things. So, once again, I want to thank you, everyone, for listening to Catching Up, where conversations continue beyond the classroom.
We'll
We'll
see
see you next
you
time.
next time.